white natives of North America was never European policy, but that didn't make life any easier for these indigenous peoples, whose relationship with the settlers would ultimately leave most of them either victimized or dead.
If you look at Native Americans from their perspective, when white people arrived, they were a disruption, they were shocking, and they were surprising in all sorts of ways. But for many Indians, they simply looked at them as another rival group. And this is one of the interesting facts about 17th century American history. From Indians' perspectives, whites were in a way a bit similar to other rival Indian nations. So perhaps you'd trade with whites, perhaps you'd make war with whites, perhaps you'd ally with the whites against another Indian nation. Indians didn't see things in white and red, if you want to put it that way, white and red terms, because the white settlements weren't powerful enough until much later in the 17th century, even into the 18th century. So they didn't see this as an invasion, as a form of genocide, in a way that would unite them as Indians against white people.
The ways and thoughts of the white men are strange.
But for all that our skins are of different hues, we are friends, Chingachgook.
You could talk about the 18th century as a 100-year period in which Indians increasingly realize that the battle is between them and white people. And in 1763, when it became clear to a host of different Indian groups in the Midwest that the wind was changing, they launched a rebellion. It was led by an Ottawa Indian named Pontiac, laid siege to the British fort at Detroit. He didn't succeed in destroying the fort, but he got the people there very scared indeed. And it made London aware of the problem of managing Indians, especially in the Midwest. And one of the most extraordinary things that happened is that George III declared in the autumn of 1763 a line of proclamation. That's what it was called, the line of proclamation, which forbade any white settler from settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains without his explicit permission. So effectively, the idea was to put the brakes on white settlement to preserve British trading relationships with the Indians. But of course, the irony here is you've got tons of white settlers moving to America looking for land. So in effect, in 1763, this royal proclamation creates a new tension between ordinary white settlers on the ground and the Crown. And it's definitely one of the contributing factors in the American Revolution. White settlers believe after 1760 the British government doesn't support them, and instead it backs the Indians. And after the American Revolution, or in the process of the American Revolution, the gloves really come off for white Americans, and the new United States is not an Indian-friendly nation in the least.
Native Americans were in an impossible situation. Side with the British, whose stronghold was Fort Detroit, and they risked the wrath of the rebel colonists based in Fort Pitt. Side with these Americans and their militiamen, and they would invite merciless retribution from the British. And as for trying to stay out of it, even if you were in Pennsylvania, a state founded by Quakers upon principles of Christian brotherly love, this too could have fatal consequences.
Now, one group that didn't pick one side or the other were the Moravian Christian Indians, who were gathered in three little communities, the most important of which was called Gnadenhutten. These Moravian Christians, there are maybe 100, 150, had tried to stay out of the war. They weren't hostile Indians. They had adopted many of the customs, the equipment, the technology of white people. They read the Bible. They sang hymns. They were, to all intents and purposes, the dream model of people back in the 17th century who wanted to convert and civilize Indians. And then a group of Pennsylvania militiamen arrived. When they had taken everything that they had that could be construed as a weapon, tools, axes, whatever, that the Indians had, which could be used against them, the militiamen got together and decided to kill every one of them. So every single Indian, in fact, the majority were women and children. I think there were around 30 men, so the rest, 60 or so, were women and children. All of them were massacred. They were brought in pairs to a hut where they were hit over the head with a cooper's mallet. And their brains were dashed out without any regard to their obviously being non-combatants. And at the end of the massacre, the white militiamen who'd committed it melted away. There was never any legal action taken against them. And their argument was that these Indians had tools with writing on them, or they had books, or they had implements they could only have stolen from white people. And that's the tragedy or the irony of all of this. In a way, the things that showed that those Christian Indians were civilized were used against them because these militiamen couldn't believe they belonged to them. But I think that's a tremendously evocative story for Pennsylvania, because what began as this noble experiment with white people and Indians living side by side had now turned into this most grisly kind of race war, in which the distinctions between good and bad Indian are totally erased. It goes back to one of the problems, I guess, for Americans, white settlers. What does it mean to be an American? What is there about America as a place which defines the people that live there? When the Boston Tea Party took place in December of 1773, there's protest against the tea taxes which are being imposed by London, and you get these patriots running onto these ships of the British East India Company and pouring the tea into the harbour. They dressed as Indians. Now that to me is tremendously interesting because they dressed as Indians to prove they were American. It's as if when you get past the stage of mastering Indians militarily, they become incredibly useful culturally in articulating Americanness, the idea of being American. And, there's a reason why there are cars called, the Cherokee, or the Pontiac. I mean, you line up the major Indian leaders, line up the major Indian tribes, and you can probably find a vehicle or a weapon named after one. The Apache helicopter, Tomahawk missile. You don't have to look very far to find that kind of connection.
And many people have pointed out the Indian appears on the nickel, but the African appears on no coins. So the Indian was sort of a symbol of America in a way. Not the full destiny of America was to be civilized, and Indians were to become civilized or they were to die out. But they still identified with America in a way that Africans could not be. The one thing that comes to mind looking at it over a long period of time is that one of the main distinguishing features of black-white relations in the United States has been the idea of the so-called one-drop rule. Purity of blood. To be white, you could not have an unknown black ancestor. It wasn't always enforced, but this was the rule. Indian blood and intermarriage with Indians, going back to John Rolfe and Pocahontas, was not taboo. So that when Oklahoma became a state, it was interesting, the Oklahoma Constitution, there were a number of part Indian figures who were involved in the setting up of the Oklahoma state government when it was in 1910. And the law said there could be no marriage between whites and blacks, and no marriage between Indians and blacks. But that left Indians and whites to freely intermarry.
The mid-18th century is considered a pivotal historical moment when the Enlightenment dream of the brotherhood of man, championed by philosophers like David Hume, Voltaire, Rousseau, and the encyclopedists, came to prominence. This period gave rise to the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, principles that fueled the American and French revolutions. But these popular democratic principles were never universally applied. Choose any intellectual giant of the Enlightenment, and almost without exception, you will have chosen a proponent of equal rights, who really believes that some men are more equal than others.
Kant is seen as one of the most important philosophers of the modern period of the past few hundred years. And he's certainly seen as the most important moral philosopher, in that the crucial idea is this idea of personhood, and you respect the personhood of others, you don't diss other people. And yet, simultaneous with that, Kant also has these writings in anthropology and physical geography, in which he basically outlines a kind of four-tiered level of human beings. It's basically a racially restrictive view of personhood, that a prerequisite for being a personhood is basically being white. It's only the European tier, the sort of top tier, who have what it takes to become full persons. And Asians, one rung below Europeans, blacks, one rung below that, Native Americans. These are the tiers. Even if they're human, they're not full persons.
The Enlightenment is a two-edged sword. It provided the basis for an argument for the social and political equality of all men. But at the same time, it provided the opportunity to look at human beings not as children of God, but as varieties of animal.
So if you decide that certain human beings are not human, they don't belong to the same species, then of course they don't have any right to sign contracts, and they can't be part of the social contract that forms your political system. And that's exactly what happens in these early democracies, is that blacks don't have any voting rights.
Many of the philosophers writing in this period played a crucial rationalizing role in justifying European imperialism, in justifying the domination of whites over people of color. So why is it then that these things are not more widely known? Why has the Kant establishment not taken up this issue? the marginalization of issues like this sort of, goes in tandem with the sanitized view of mainstream philosophers. So that, you represent Locke, you represent Kant, you represent Hegel, you represent these people in ways that, does not address the sort of racist dimensions of their thought. And that sort of, contributes to a picture of the modern period from which race has been whitewashed out.
In the name of their Majesties, Ferdinand and Isabella, King and Queen of Castile, Leon and Aragon, I now take possession of this land and name it San Salvador. Hooray!